Split-second reaction times are everything in first-person shooters. In the beginning, these reaction times were the things that crafted rivalries between the best of friends. Even if you were playing alone, single-player games can still carry a competitive nature. While the story was nothing to write home about, there were always high scores and speed runs to try and one-up your friends. You have games like Wolfenstein 3D, Quake, and Doom from the early days of PC gaming that had fast-paced gameplay with a clear but clunky by modern standards control scheme. They seemed to be on top of their game. That was until Valve decided to shake up the industry.
Welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System. This automated train is provided for the security and convenience of the Black Mesa Research Facility personnel. The time is 8:47 a.m.
The launch of Half-Life and the industry being introduced to the possibility of narrative-driven experiences, the boomer shooter, as it would come to be known, was on the way out. Half-Life modernized the controls of the FPS and moved the industry forward in an unexpected way, but something about the old days still seems to resonate with some.
I love first-person shooters and always wanted to make a first-person shooter. And when I first started this project, it wasn't called Severed Steel yet. It was called Endless Rain, which was based on this kind of like obscure Half-Life map from way back in the day. But it was going to be a first-person shooter, but with like a super in-depth world with like puzzles and a deep plot inspired by Deus Ex. But the scope was just way too big for me, so I pulled the scope back and became Severed Steel. It became like a way more straightforward first-person shooter, which is like straight up combat. I ended up going for more like an old school Half-Life or like Quake or Unreal Tournament kind of deathmatch vibe. And I think that was the right scope for a solo dev on the first time project, because I could just like focus on making a super addictive combat loop, and just focus on making that addicting and just mixing it up to keep it fresh. So once I realized that was the way to go, I just started plugging away, and from that came Severed Steel.
My first introduction to the first-person shooter that would soon be known as Severed Steel came from a GIF on Reddit by creator Matt Larrabee, showing off his work in progress for a game codenamed Impact. The game would later be renamed to Severed Steel before launch. The game he showed off consisted of wall running, flips, and headshots galore in a smooth motion. It truly felt that it could have been ripped straight from a pre-rendered and pre-scripted trailer that no one had seen yet. People were excited for what was to come. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Let's take it back to where it all started. Let's take it back to the events that took the game from concept to near perfect execution. During the beginning of development, Matt was a primary school educator teaching students computer programming when he thought he'd give development on his own game a chance. Every morning before work and every evening after, Matt would dive into Unreal Engine 4 and learn the ins and outs of the engine. The day job that Matt held at the school gave him a stable income while he worked on the game until the COVID-19 pandemic swept through the world.
Clear your retirement account.
To get started, yeah.
You quit your job.
Yeah.
So I mean,
yeah.
before we get into the game, why don't we talk? Well, it's fascinating because, you know, I would love to see the survivor or the successful bias to this story, because the story is a beautiful story when it works, right? Which is the Cuphead guys, they mortgage their house. Right. Yeah. But I would assume more often than not, it doesn't work. But I would also assume you're never going to be successful if you don't take that risk, right? So just before we get into the game, what were you thinking? Because you were teaching computer programming. Just kind of go with, I want to know about that before we get to anything else, because it's so inspiring and horrific.
Thank you. I mean, I guess it's a hobby that's gotten out of control a little bit. I was working on game dev. What I would do is I do it before work. I'd wake up before work and work on it, and sometimes after work.
And you were a teacher, just so you're teaching middle school kids.
Yeah. Teaching computer programming, particularly this website called Scratch. I don't know if anyone in chat has ever used Scratch, but it's like a 2D game programming thing. And I taught that for years at like a public middle school.
Was that a full-time, that was a full-time gig?
Yeah, I was like, I was doing the full-time, stable
okay
teaching thing, union, all that fun stuff.
Okay.
but it was just game deving as a hobby, and people on Twitter started noticing this game was called Impact back then. It wasn't called Severed Steel.
Right.
And it didn't look or play like it did now. It was far rougher. But people on Twitter and Reddit started taking interest, and then before I know it, I was kind of talking to my publishers, and then, you know, before I knew it, I had a choice to pursue this full time. And there wasn't like a clarifying moment when it happened. I guess when I signed to Digerati was the moment when it happened.
At first, he aimed for the stars, wanting to develop an open-world RPG in the vein of The Elder Scrolls, but it was quickly scaled down to what would become the Endless Reign era of development. This is when the gameplay became faster paced and the levels became much closer in quarters. As development went on, Matt was forced to temper his ambitions and scale down drastically. After all, this was just a passion project. All while working on the game in his free time, he would post updates to his Twitter and YouTube channels showing iterations of the game's progress. Things were going pretty smoothly for Matt when all of a sudden he accidentally checked the box that would change the course of the game. You see, even in fast-paced first-person games like Titanfall and Mirror's Edge, where fast-paced motion is the name of the game, you only have so much degree of head movement. As you are jumping from building to building, dispatching enemies left and right, you can only look as far down as your feet. If you pass up the enemy as you're trying to get around them, you better hope that you have the reaction time to turn around because you can't flip. But what if you could? This was actually during the game's Impact stage of development, and a result of a suggestion from Reddit users after posting samples of what he was working on to different subreddits. See, before becoming Severed Steel, the game went through several iterations, including him actually trying his ambitious open-world RPG. On the Joystick Junkies podcast, every Wednesday at noon on this very channel. God, what was that, Wayne?
So it was kind of funny. I finished Severed Steel, and I started like mess with my next game, and it originally started off as like an open world RPG. Like I'm always trying to like my end goal, like my ultimate game is one day like an open world RPG, like in like the Elder Scrolls vein. But every time I start it, I get like 10% into it, and I'm like, oh geez, like, it's insane. Like what am I doing? Like solo developing a Bethesda game? It's so stupid.
Yeah,
but
I remember what was the very first one that was on your YouTube channel?
Yeah, you can even see years ago.
Yeah.
It was called Greylock, and I always do that. Every few years I start Greylock, which is like my ultimate RPG, and I always get a little bit into it. And I'm like, this is too much, and then I cut a lot of features back. So like the first time I did that, I ended up making Severed Steel. So I got too a little far, and I'm like, okay, maybe I should make a first-person shooter instead. So after I finished Severed Steel, I'm like, all right, like I'm a game dev now. I've launched a game. It's time to make a Bethesda game. And I got a few months into it. And I'm like, geez, like I'm still not ready yet, but I think I am ready to make, if not an open world like RPG with like villages and NPCs wandering around. Like I think I am ready to make an open world game, but with Severed Steel's like tight paced combat format. So that was the birth of Echo Point Nova, where I made it far enough to my open world RPG where I had like a functional world, but then I took that world and I put fast-paced shooter mechanics into it.
After toning everything back and refining his FPS to a state worthy of being shown off to the public, game publisher Digerati came into the picture and gave Matt the opportunity of a lifetime. He would be able to work on the game full-time and finish it faster than he could if he had a day job. The race was on, but Matt knew that the overly ambitious ideas that he had for the full game, even after toning it down from the open world, were far too lofty for a one-man development team. So he had to pick and choose what would stay in the final build.
I mean, I guess, yeah, the fact that it wasn't indie helps, because I could kind of just throw myself into the idea to start off, and, you know, I wasn't answering to anybody when I first got started. The idea came, I don't know, it just came, as I was messing with voxel stuff for this open world RPG I was working on. And then I just was like, well, what if I combined a shooter with it? Because I loved FPSs as a kid.
Right.
And it worked out, but I mean, it has been a hassle, and I have to thank Digerati for taking a risk with me, because by the time they got their hands on the project, okay, so you were saying like destructibility opens up all these risks. When Digerati first took me on, you could shoot a hole in the floor and fall through the world to your death on every map.
Okay, well,
and literally every map you could do that on.
Right.
But they saw it and they went for it. So I definitely thank them for taking a risk.
So in a world with an emphasis on destruction, where the selling point could arguably be based solely on everything being destructible, nothing could go wrong, right? Wait, I think I've heard about a game like this before. But surely, if it takes a team as large as Microsoft's to create a world that's fully destructible... Wait. So it was relegated to a completely obscure multiplayer title, not even included in the main game? And it didn't even play that well? What the hell? That was the whole selling point. So if Microsoft couldn't pull it off, and their vast amounts of money, how the hell could one guy do it? Well, I'll tell you what, come see. In a virtual space, 2D images are made up of pixels, microscopic squares on a display that carry all three colors of the RGB spectrum. For 2D pixel art games like Stardew Valley, these work like a dream. They're even used in 3D games in order to translate the image into the 2D plane that your monitor uses. In modern 3D games, you have two options to create the massive and beautiful worlds that we've come to love. The most common are polygons. If you've played games for a while, I'm sure you've heard polygon count emphasized in character models. The more polygons you are able to include in a model, the more details you can fit. Then there are voxels. Short for volumetric pixels, they're a collection of cubes that can make 3D models. Most engines render their graphics using polygons and need the extra computing power for breaking things apart and to do things like this. With structures and voxel-based engines consisting of millions of little cubes, all you have to do is unrender them one at a time. Maybe with a bullet? It can't be that simple, can it? But no game could be sold just for its destructibility. So what makes this game so damned addicting? It's the perfect combination of if you think it, you can do it, and its execution. Imagine this. You have this annoying enemy hitting you with pot shots from the air on a jetpack. What would you do? Well, why not just steal his sidearm and give him a pot shot of his own? Remember, if you think it, you can do it. The amount of agency to feel like a complete and utter unstoppable war machine given to the player is unreal. While writing this, I remembered something that Matt told me during our interview.
Yeah, scripted events in video games, it's kind of a weird concept because the whole point of video games is like super interactive, the player's in control, the player does what they want. But then to get a good scripted event, you have to kind of force the player to look in a certain direction. You have to kind of take control away from the player a bit. Like Ken Levine, the guy who made BioShock, he talks about this a lot whenever he gives like speeches about game design, where he wants to come up with a way to tell like a super interesting story with really interesting visual things happening without the scripting, because like he made the BioShock series, which is known for really crazy set pieces, like BioShock Infinite, all these like just zeppelins exploding and all sorts of things that requires you to take control of the player for a moment, so they look in a certain direction and they see what you want them to see. But in making Severed Steel, I don't have to worry about that, because I decided from the start that I wanted to just give the player total control and let them make the crazy moments for themselves. Like, one advantage of that is, like, Severed Steel has this destruction system. You can blow a hole in pretty much any wall in the game. And in, like, a AAA cinematic first-person shooter like Call of Duty, you might have a moment where there's a special wall you can blow up that you'll see, like, a transparent C4 on it, and you run up to it and you press F, and your character puts a C4 on it, the wall explodes, and bullet time happens, and then your character automatically moves into the room, and then you get to, like, shoot the individual guys. But what I think indie games can do, and what games like Severed Steel can do, is you can make, instead of that being a scripted moment, you can let the player do it whenever you want. And it might not be as polished as a AAA experience. The player controls it, and that I'm way more interested in that, giving the player control to do things when they want, as opposed to like a super polished, scripted, like narrated experience.
Now, why can't more games allow players to live through these things with the interactivity that games are meant to provide? Thank you all for watching The Start of the Legacy, the story of Severed Steel and the founding of Greylock Studios. Matt's story proves that with a good idea, the thirst for knowledge, and the drive to complete a goal, you can create anything. Just remember, if you need a reason to keep going or a goal to strive for, it's never too far away. If you're going through a rough time, reach out to a loved one. Who knows? They may have gone through something similar in the past and could help you out. Just read a good book or play a favorite game in the meantime to keep yourself going. And at the end of the day, I hope you have an extraordinary one.